Welcome to Just Another Nobody. I'm Thomas Fawkes. You're totally not an alien transforming cyborg monster from the future. Today I'm going to be talking about cultural momentum using empires in fiction and history as an example. Alright, look, for an empire to develop, you need power and you need money. Now, in every culture, in every society, and in every economic system, power and money saturate and condense exponentially over time. For example, to simplify it, if you had an island with 100 people who all started out with $1, but one person is just a little bit more skilled at investing that money, and say they are 10% more effective, and everyone else is just, a little bit effective. So everyone else, after a day, they get $1.01. And this other guy gets $1.10. So the next day, so if he's 10% more effective, then the other people get to $1 and, almost 2 cents or 3 cents or whatever. And he's already at $1.21. So that growth increases exponentially. The more money and power you have, the more influence you can exert to create more money and power for yourself, which therefore gives you more money and power. This is one example of some of the common principles of power that create empires. Political systems, they collect over time and then they break, and they collect and they break. And actually, I'm going to be saying political systems pretty often, but I mean political socioeconomic systems, because they are tied up in each other in how they function. Empires are an example of what I call cultural momentum, the tendency of a culture to increase movement in a certain direction. A lot of this has to do with, if you look at Eliezer Yudkowsky's blog called Less Wrong, he talks about evaporative cooling. When you have a bunch of atoms and their heat is a certain average, they're not all moving at the same rate. Some are moving faster and some are moving slower. The ones that are most likely to get booted out are the ones that are moving too fast. The ones at the extreme of heat and movement will just, occasionally you'll get one that'll get a high enough heat signature that'll fly away. And that's the same thing that happens with cultures and ideas. Cultural momentum also has a lot to do with the development of cults, in that those who are more likely to disagree or to inhabit opinions that vary more from the mean or from the average, they are more likely to leave. Going back to Eliezer Yudkowsky's blog, he talks about a few different cults who said when the end of the world was going to be. When those prophecies didn't come true, you had the more skeptical, or at least moderately minded people, judgmental, critical people, people who think, would leave. The people who remained are those who would be more intensely focused on it. There's one type of empire that happens a lot in fiction that I have a problem with. And that is what I'll call the stationary empire, or the empire as a symbol of a nation or even a city. Few examples of this, by the way. I love these books, but this is a flaw that they all sort of share in common. The Emperor's Blades by Brian Staveley. The Black Prism by Brent. Dune by Frank Herbert, the series. And then last but not least, the Galactic Empire, or the Galactic Republic in Star Wars. These empires, especially Star Wars, exhibit traits more like nations than they do empires. Here's a couple of historical examples of empires. You have the Roman Empire, and you have the British Empire. Now, how did they become empires, and how did they continue to exist? They're in a constant state of expansion. Sometimes retraction, that can happen too, but mainly expansion. One reason for that is, as an empire expands, you need military might. So you pay your soldiers, and your empire expands a bit, and then you might be running out of money, or you might not even have the money to pay your soldiers. So therefore, you need to conquer more land to take more money and more land in order to pay your soldiers. And therefore, in order to get that more land and money, you need to conquer more. You're using these soldiers to expand, but then you have to recruit more soldiers, even from the places that you are invading. If you watch like the movie Gladiator, the main character, maybe a generation or so back, his area was conquered and then he was a soldier for the Roman Empire to continue trying to expand. And what happens when an empire can't expand anymore? Then they start running out of money to pay their people. Empires, kind of like, colonialism or even neo-colonialism, they rely upon the extortion and the extraction of wealth and resources from other nations. What does this have to do with cultural momentum? What will happen a lot in fiction is that you have a giant empire that exists. But as time goes on and that power is continuing to consolidate, the poor and the weak and the downtrodden are, getting trodden down and ground under the heel of the oppressive government that is ignoring the needs of its people. In a lot of these stories, empires fall apart because the power continues to get consolidated into fewer and fewer people, which may be the nation that instigated the forming of this empire. And so other people around it get more and more frustrated until it breaks out into violence. Now, this is a process that can take hundreds of years. But one nice thing about the world today is you can look around and see quite a few examples of this, and nations that are in different stages of this cycle of condensation of power and violence. You have certain nations in the Middle East and in South America and Africa that have power consolidating into the hands of a militaristic few, and other people become more frustrated. One way that some empire-like cultures, or just cultures in general, maintain their existence is through a sort of multi-party equilibrium. Some writers do this as noble houses. Some people do this as political parties, or it could be even businesses that are in competition with each other. An empire will often perform violence upon its own people when the external foes are gone. And an empire's people will perform violence upon the empire when their needs are no longer met. Last note that I will make has a lot to do with empire building, but it has to do with the consolidation of power. Capitalism, or in other words, free trade and economics that go into the hands of fewer and fewer folk with fewer and fewer limitations upon them, eventually transforms into something like feudalism or monarchy. We can see this in many nations today, except it is happening with political parties or other money and power accumulating organizations, such as corporations that will put politicians into power in exchange for either favorable rulings and laws and things to pass, or just outright manipulation and control. Apart from the cycles of power and money condensing, there are cycles in empires about the ruling classes, whether that's a government or the nation that is extracting money and resources from their vassals. There is a cycle of caring for those with less, or caring for those whose support make your lifestyle possible. And this often goes through its own cycles. A nation that is willing to sacrifice those who have less eventually will destroy itself, because as people become more selfish, they become less able to care for the very structures that allowed them to be selfish. Their prosperity becomes the scaffolding of their own destruction. So as you're reading literature, or, if you want to write it too, keep your eyes out for these patterns and cycles of money, of power, of care for the poor and the needy, because it is upon these cycles that great governmental entities are formed and destroyed, more often than not through violence. This has been another episode of Just Another Nobody. Thanks. Peace out.